So we are still doing information processing. It is chapter 7. We have only a few slides left. Now here we are talking about metacognition. You probably are very familiar with the word meta and what happens to the words that come after meta. As you know, your Mireho just studies what? Meta-memory. She studies meta-memory. Why do you think she calls it not memory but meta-memory? Does anybody know what she does, huh?
Does she study beyond memory?
Beyond memory. She studies people's own assessments of memory. So what do you think about how your memory works? How do you think about how your memory works? And so when we're talking about metacognition, it is your understanding of how your mind works. How do you learn better? How do you remember better? Right? That's why this word meta denotes almost a stepping out of your frame, yourself, and basically looking at whatever process is being considered. If it's memory, memory. Here it's cognition. So, okay, it's awareness and understanding of various aspects of thoughts. And in children, you see their understanding of mind. We're going to talk about theory of mind, which develops or it develops through school years as well, but it shows significant improvements during early childhood. And also knowledge of mental activity, their understanding of what cognitive capacities are, strategies, and task variables. So knowledge of the mind, we actually talked about this. Knowledge of strategies, we talked about it in our last lecture, if you remember. Knowledge of strategies, school children are better at identifying effective strategies for learning. And by 10 years, children have effective strategies that they use when they're confronted with a learning task. Young teenagers are also able to reason about multiple variables that affect learning. And so there's also something called cognitive self-regulation that is useful for children's understanding of how their mind works best. So this is process of continually monitoring and controlling progress toward a goal. So this is basically looking to see whether you're learning well. If you're not learning well, changing strategies. So you evaluate a strategy, whether it works, whether it doesn't work, and redirecting. If it doesn't work, selecting a different alternative and trying that alternative for successful outcome. Here, parents and teachers are vital in teaching young children different strategies. So if you're trying to learn words, so is there anybody here who's taking a foreign language class? Yeah, what language are you taking? French. Okay. What level are you at? Are you a beginner? Are you a beginner? So French is French to you right now. A very bad joke. Thanks for laughing. But so if you're learning new words, how do you go about learning them?
You have to memorize them.
How do you memorize them?
By being exposed to them.
Do you just read them?
I see them all the time in the textbook.
In the textbook. Okay, so you are trying to memorize by sight. You're looking at these words, and if you look longer, you think it's going to be memorized better for you. Does anybody else have a different strategy for memorization, Banu?
I associate the words that I know in my language.
Yes, and with French, it should be a little bit easier since you know English. How about you?
I try to use new words in a sentence and try to make meaning of it. So I thought I remember it better.
Very nice. Are you, you're not a psych major, are you?
No, I am psych major.
You're a psych major. Who's the language major here? Who's doing language? Yes. How do you learn new words?
I try to learn them in context also, with sentences.
I thought because you had such a good strategy, you had a very good background, plus obviously I confused the two of you. I'm not going to make anyone else, Ipek?
I'm taking Italian since a year, and I'm taking Italian since
Eh?
a year, and I'm creating the exact word, like what can it be, like whatever sounds so Italian to me. So when I'm memorizing the words change, like go, and whichever word sounds best to me, I use it, and it's usually this.
That's okay. Intuition is guiding your efforts in learning language. Well, that's interesting. Okay. You pick. Flashcards. Finally, somebody who uses something that I do too. Not that it's the best strategy. The best strategy is what works for you, right? And flashcards work for you?
Yeah.
Is it the looking at the flashcards? Is it the writing the flashcards?
It's both. I write the flashcards myself, of course.
Mhm.
Then when I'm learning a word, I can separate the ones that I know very well
Mhm.
from the ones I don't, and then I can focus on the ones I don't.
Yes.
So I have two piles, and the more I focus on what I don't know, the pile that I know best gets bigger, and that helps.
That's great. Yes, this is how I studied for GRE. Yes. One day, if you're going to take the GRE, it actually is a method that works, for me at least. So basically, metacognition involves that you generate strategies, you choose among alternatives, and then you self-regulate in the sense that you check to see whether that strategy is working. If it's not working, you're going to go maybe generate an alternative strategy and choose that strategy. And the question here is, when do children learn? It seems like they are poor at this when they are at preschool ages. And this is very understandable because they know very little about the mind. They make systematic mistakes about the mind. But during school years, by 10 years of age, they know how to come up with strategies, hold a strategy, maintain it, right? Okay. Promoting children's cognitive self-regulation. Here, teachers and parents can emphasize the importance of planful learning, suggest effective learning strategies. If the child is not coming up with learning strategies, for example, the parent or the teacher can make suggestions. Emphasize that the child has to monitor their progress, that they need to check whether it's working or not, and provide for evaluation of strategy effectiveness, and let them know of the outcome as to whether the strategy worked or didn't. So now, yes?
How can they monitor themselves?
No, they basically, teachers and parents talk about how important it is that the child monitors whether the strategy is working or not. The teacher or parent sees it by the outcome, the product, but then they also have to make the child understand that the child also has to monitor it. So this is the last slide for information processing approach. The question is, what are the advantages of information processing approach and what could be its limitations? And we talked about it at the very beginning when we opened this chapter. The advantages are, among the advantages, one of them is that it allows for breaking complex cognitive activities into precise components. So we're looking at memory, we're looking at cognitive self-regulation. It provides details of age and skill-related differences. It's very systematic. It describes precise mechanisms of cognitive development, right? It has clear predictions. It tests these in very clear ways, and then it comes up with these mechanisms of how development might be taking place. What are the limitations? The components are hard to combine into the broad picture. So there's a lot of research in memory, a lot of research in meta-memory, a lot of research in cognitive inhibition, a lot of research in cognitive self-regulation. Bringing all of them together to tell a comprehensive story, a cohesive story about cognitive development from information processing approach is a little bit more challenging than what we saw, say, from Piaget. Because it's not one theory, it's basically a little bit more piecemeal. And computer metaphors simplify real-life experiences, and they overlook nonlinear aspects of interaction with others. So again, the child is situated in a social context, and our minds don't work very cleanly in terms of it's so nice when you sketch out a cognitive mechanism with boxes and arrows, but the human mind, immersed in a social world, actually has more bidirectional relations, and the unknown of the social interaction is always a variable. It's also slow to include biology and evolution. I didn't realize that Emre Bey has a little room in there. It's the first time I'm sorry for whatever. You can edit me out. But yes, there's a room. After class, I need to see what's in that room. Okay, so let's turn our attention to language. And since that was the end of last chapter, this is the beginning of the other, it's going to be much easier for Emre Bey to cut me out, pointing out the hiding room in there. Yes. Had you guys noticed?
Yes.
Ah. İşte. Selective attention. I only focus on you. All right. So here we go. We are now focusing on language development. This is chapter 9. And we will talk about what language development is, what are the components of language learning. We're also going to talk about how language development happens. How do children learn language? We're not going to talk about adults learning of second language. That's not under this topic for developmental psychology. Although there's growing research, growing literature on bilingual children, obviously, because now that the world has become a much more interconnected and global place, there's a lot of moving about. People actually take their cultures and languages to new countries that they immigrate to. And there are now a new generation of children who are growing bilingual. However, the research, although it is making great strides, is a little bit slower to catch up with this trend. Also, there's a lot of variability in bilingualism in the sense that the new countries' language might be very different or very similar to the home language, for example. The age at which children are exposed to the new language also differs. Whether parents actually speak both languages or not differs. To what extent differs. So a Turkish couple who immigrate to the United States, both of them might speak English, but how good they speak English is another question. How old the child is when they move is another question. So all of these variables are very important in our understanding of bilingual children's both acquisition of that second language and also their processing of it. And so there's a lot of research coming up, but in this chapter we won't talk at length about bilingualism at all. But if you're interested, please go ahead and read. If you want guidance, let me know. And so, language development. What are the components of language? Now, language has 4 basic components here to be learned. One of them is phonology. Phonology are the rules about structures and sequences of speech sounds. It's the sounds, right? And imagine a baby who is just born. We will see that that baby will be able to recognize all sounds. However, in time, they're going to start selecting the sounds that appear in their language and start becoming desensitized to those sounds that appear in other languages but not their own. So phonology is one of the first steps in learning a language for babies. Then comes semantics. When we talk about language learning, probably semantics is the first thing that we think about because it's learning words, right? But even if, for example, I could somehow magically give you, does anybody know Chinese here? No. Yes. If I could give you 1,000 words in Chinese that you could actually recognize them and say them, would that make you a proficient speaker of Chinese? No. No. When somebody asks your Cedoca how much Turkish you have, he says, I know about 500 to 1,000 words. Of course, most of them are words for food. Mercimek çorbası, tavuklu çorba. Of course, of course. Now I jump in and say yes, but it is not very functional. So it's not 500, 1,000 words because he doesn't really have a lot of grammatical structure to actually use those words in grammatical sentences, right? I mean, his grammatical sentences are more, again, restaurant speak. Bir tavuk çorba lütfen gibi. Yes, and he wouldn't contest me on this. And also morphology, which are grammatical markers. So for example, think about if you wanted to make something plural in English. So if we are talking about a rabbit versus there are 2 of these rabbits, you make it rabbits, right? That S makes it plural, and that's the morphological marker, right? If we thought about the same thing in Turkish, tavşan, tavşanlar, right? Lar becomes this grammatical morphological marker. So it's not only learning words, or it's not only about knowing where to put words, but it's also about these little sound bites that actually give grammatical meaning. And also pragmatics. We actually seem to forget about pragmatics most of the time when we think about language until you go to that country, right? So for example, Elif is learning French. Let's say, I mean, I'm sure she's going to be very successful, but she passes this course with an A, she takes the next one, the next one. How many of these French courses are there? 4, 5. She passes all of them. And then she buys a plane ticket to Paris. She lands. Now, her expectation is that she's going to understand everything and she's going to be able to express herself well. Do you think she's going to encounter any challenges? She will, yes. Why? Because probably she has not used the language in daily interaction with native speakers, right? So there is a lot that we learn in communication with one another. We learn of what is acceptable and what is not acceptable to say. Sometimes a sentence can be very grammatical, but it's wrong to your ears if it happens, meaning it is not ever used that way by people, right? So that is a matter of pragmatics. Knowing how to address people is a matter of pragmatics. Probably there should be a tiny bit of difference in how you talk to me, not because I'm important, but because we have social roles, how you talk to me versus how you talk to your best friend. Versus how you talk to your boyfriend. Yes, nobody addresses me as aşkım here. They may like me a lot. Yes? Well, why is that not happening? Because that word is reserved for your significant other. Well, okay, let's put aşkım aside. Nobody says canım to me either. I mean, nobody meaning, I have loved ones too. I mean, you guys, right? Again, something is wrong about it, right? And so that's a matter, again, of pragmatics, knowing how to. Then you guys all have this struggle when you write an email to a professor, not knowing how to address that person. For clarity's sake, I am not Mrs. Ilgaz, right? I have gotten in the past, dear Mrs. Ilgaz. Who is Mrs. Ilgaz? Mrs. Ilgaz is my mother. It is true. Yes, obviously, I chose not to take a last name, right? So, okay, I have once or twice in the past also gotten Mrs. Allen, which makes no sense to me, which I don't even call myself that. And then, I mean, there are so many variations of this. Nobody has yet called me Hande, like Dear Hande or something, but Jed gets Dear Jed, for example, because you think pragmatically that works in that language, but it doesn't work in mine. You're thinking about how I will perceive it. By the way, Jed doesn't like Dear Jed either. As I think he talks about it in his first class, so there's no ambiguity there. Usually, I mean, common thing, you either say professor or doctor so-and-so, right? If somebody has worked hard enough that they have gotten their PhD working, they don't need to be identified with their marital status, Mr., Mrs., Miss, right? They are past that point. Yes. So anyway, so this is an issue of pragmatics. I hope this stays on the internet forever and other students also watch it to know never to call me Mrs. So-and-so. So, anyways, now pragmatics is that. You had a question. Do you still have that question?
It wasn't a question.
Exactly. So the pronunciation of it is different too. Okay. On the surface, a fast synopsis of what happens. Acquisition of first language seems rather automatic. It seems like every baby learns language at one point. Most children start babbling around 6 months of age. Most children say their first words around 12 months. There are individual differences, right? So it could be that one child says their first meaningful word at age of 8 months, another one at 2 years. There is huge variability. So if you were a late talker, don't take it personally. It happens. And if you were an early talker, don't feel like a genius because that also happens too. All right. And most children have a large number of words and express themselves intelligibly, meaning in ways that others can understand, by 4 or 5 years of age. The question is, how does this happen? Is it due to biological maturation, right? There are several different theories. One of them is the nativist theory, where Chomsky has actually proposed forcefully that there is a language acquisition device, LAD, which biologically prepares infants to learn the rules of their language. And he claims that there is a universal grammar. Universal grammar has different variations of parameters, and when the infants are exposed to language, they start selecting those parameters based on the workings of this device. Steven Pinker has famously, in a book titled The Blank Slate, has said, a child learns language just like a spider learns how to weave or spin webs. They don't need to be taught. You don't take a spider and say, itsy bitsy spider, now I'm going to show you how to, spin a web. You don't. And you don't have to a child because they will do it. They're predestined biologically to do this. Is that so? At the other end, we have interactionists who say inner capacities and environment work together. Now you think, okay, I mean, these guys wouldn't actually say environment is not necessary. After all, for Chomsky too, the child has to be exposed to a language in order to select the parameters. But here, this environment, the social interaction, is doing a more elementary, more substantial, more fundamental job. If it weren't in place, child will not learn language even though they have the capability to do so. Right? That would be the argument. Okay, and social context is important. Yes, one language acquisition device, but multiple languages. Before we get here, I've always wanted to do something. If I put you on the spot, would you be too angry at me? You are my only Russian speaker here, correct?
Yeah.
Yes. Let's find a sentence for her to say. Construct a sentence for me. There you are. The sentence is, while I was walking to the car, I saw a cat in a bag. Can we get this in Arabic, please? While I was walking to the car, you can say to my car too if you wanted, I saw a cat in a bag. It's music to my ears. But I didn't understand the word. Okay, so but the problem here, I mean, we have to understand, is that she spoke slower too. With that, it sounded like beautiful music, but I didn't know where a word started and where a word ended. I don't think you did either, right? It was just a stream of beautiful sounds, right, to our untrained ears. And so what it is you think about it then, babies who are born into worlds of language, right? They are hearing continuous streams of sounds. And one of their first tasks is choosing those sounds, understanding which sounds are what, but also parsing the words. What's a word, right? How do I understand? For example, from what he said, what was car? What was cat? Where did those words start and end? These are very important questions. Another one concerns, obviously, grammar. Now, languages have different ways of ordering the words. For example, this is an English sentence where we say, Ayşenur forgot her bag. Okay. And we see Ayşenur, subject, forgot is verb, her bag is the object. And so English always follows this rule. It's subject, verb, object, SVO. How about Turkish? Ayşenur çantasını unuttu would be the classic way of saying this, which would be subject, object, verb. But can you not say unuttu Ayşenur çantasını? Yes. Can you not say çantasını Ayşenur unuttu? You can. Unuttu çantasını Ayşe. You can too. Turkish has flexible word order. Although studies show that about 70% of what children hear, young children hear, is actually in this order, right? There is no right order, but the more commonly used order is this. We only change order when we want to emphasize something. Yes. So the question then is, how does one device help children around the world to learn different languages with different grammatical rules? The universal grammar idea says that there's a store of rules common to all human languages. So all of these orderings are there, and the child's job, or this device's job, is to select which of these orders the language they hear adhere to. Is there any support for biological language preparedness? It seems like language is mostly unique to human beings. Though some chimpanzees have shown success in learning sign language and the symbol language, the problem with them is that they seem to be limited in grammatical development. Go back to Jeannie. Remember how much she learned of language, but again, she was a little bit stuck when it came to grammatical or grammatically complex sentences, both in producing them and sometimes understanding. So this seems to be a point at which they stop. Also, we have to keep in mind that most of the chimpanzees that have been taught language have been in captivity in labs for years, where they get extensive training and human interaction. So it's not like any chimpanzee we select off the jungle and expose to language is going to learn language all of a sudden. It might also be due to their lack of social understanding, in the sense that they're not socially as developed as we are, in trying to, for example, teach others information, in trying to communicate with others about interesting information that are not about life-threatening things or food sources. Another piece of support for biological language preparedness is about brain structure. So there seems to be regions that are predisposed to language processing. We have all heard of the Broca's area and the Wernicke's area. However, I mean, the recent picture doesn't look as simple as this, because we now also know that it's not only these two areas that are working when you are processing or producing language, but in production we use a lot of frontal lobe help, and temporal lobes also become very active when you are comprehending language. Also, we know that with certain early brain trauma, language processing can actually migrate through plasticity to other parts of the brain, no problem. And so in that sense, this picture is not as simple as what we thought it was 30 years ago. Okay. There seems to be a sensitive period, which is during brain lateralization. Two sources of indirect evidence give us this. One is deaf children in American Sign Language. So children who were taught American Sign Language in late childhood and adolescence did not become proficient like the children who learned American Sign Language as a first language, which is understandable, correct? So if just because they're deaf doesn't mean that they're going to be able to understand or become very proficient speakers of ASL in later years. They have to, like other children, learn it as a native language during early childhood. Also, we have evidence from second language learners. It's our ability to learn and speak a second language with ease declines with age. That doesn't mean you can't learn a language. Otherwise, what is Elif doing in French class? Correct? You can't, but it becomes a tiny bit harder. An interesting case is children with Williams syndrome. Have you heard of Williams syndrome before? No. In 5 minutes, I'm going to give you a brief glimpse of Williams syndrome, but next semester, if you do take 350, there we're going to talk under neuroconstructivism. We will talk about Karmilov-Smith's work, where it actually uses children with Williams syndrome to explain their both language and mathematical difficulties and how they may or may not be related. Now, Williams syndrome is a rare disorder. It's a biological disorder. It's based on chromosomes. And children are born with lower IQs, but strong orientation toward the social world. See, autism is so interesting, also very sad, but for scientists it's very interesting, because the child with autism seems to exhibit profound difficulties with social issues, right? But here what is happening is that these children are socially very interested. They like talking to people, they like looking at people, they like being with people, and they also seem to have good language early on because they know a lot of words. But they are poor at grammatical rule learning, and they also seem to have repetitive language. They don't really take into account what the other person might be interested in. They might focus on what they're interested in, talk about it forever. So it might be that the child's interested in trains, but you aren't. And the child comes and talks about trains for 15 minutes, for example, which again violates pragmatic rules, right? And so here, what it is though, the case, first it was some people made it a case that the fact that these children had language, strong language skills, showed that language was independent from other cognitive abilities. But later on, especially Karmilov-Smith showed us that these are not independent systems. I will not go into it. We will talk about it for 50 minutes next semester. But just know that the cases indicate that language is not separate from other human abilities, as Chomsky's language acquisition device assumes. So I'm going to leave you with this last slide. What are the limitations of the nativist perspective? There is no agreement on universal grammar rules, for one thing. Another one is that it contradicts observation of development. It seems like children actually make a lot of mistakes when they learn a language. You know how, like, when you guys were learning English, irregular verbs were a pain, right? Like write, wrote, but not righted, right? And so English-speaking children have the same difficulty when they're learning. 4 or 5-year-olds regularly make mistakes in irregular verbs, right? Which tell us that there's a lot of learning going on. Theory also lacks comprehensiveness. It ignores the quality of the language input that the child is getting. What kind of language is this child hearing? It ignores role of social experience, and it ignores the role of other cognitive abilities that may be helping language development, right? Memory, for example, is one of them. And so we will start with the Interactionist Perspective on Wednesday. I again apologize for the blunder about this morning. I will announce for next week too that we are going to meet at 8:30.